Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to all those who are joining us on Facebook and in your homes. My name is Jasmine Godhelf Winship. I am the Deputy Regional Director for J Street in New England, and I feel very lucky to be joined today by J Street's Executive Director in Israel, Nadav Tamir. Um, all eyes were on Israel this week as the new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, and his coalition government were sworn in. While Benjamin Netanyahu's 12-year reign is now over, the occupation still remains, and new Prime Minister Bennett is considered by many to be even more pro-settlement and anti-Palestinian. What will his leadership look like? How could his cabinet or coalition partners provide a counterbalance to his policy? All big questions for us, and we look forward to answering many more of them today with Nadav. For those of you who are interested in asking your own questions, please do put them in the Q&A button. Click the Q&A button and put them in. As I said, we are lucky to be joined by Nadav Tamir, who has dedicated his career to public service, joining the Israeli Foreign Ministry in 1993 and serving in multiple roles, including political officer at the Israeli Embassy in Washington, D.C. In 2006, he was named Israeli Consul General to New England, a position he held until 2010. Upon returning to Israel, he joined the policy planning unit of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, where he served until accepting the position of senior advisor to then President Shimon Peres. We are happy to have him now at J Street as the Israel director. Welcome, Nadav.
Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you, all of you. I feel very much at home at J Street.
I wanted to start off by touching on the Israeli airstrikes that we saw in Gaza yesterday, which Israeli officials said were in response to incendiary balloons sent by Hamas into southern Israel. We're just days into this new government and a month out from the last round of violence that was one of the worst we've seen in the region in some years. Why was this decision made, and how is this action being received by the Israeli public, internationally, and even by the new coalition government itself?
So first of all, what happened yesterday has to do with the different set of politics, the Palestinian and the Israeli. In the Palestinian side, we have the right-wing groups that wanted to showcase that they're not nobody's going to stop them from doing this flag march. And even though they were it was delayed until after the government was sworn, they couldn't, interfere with the swearing in of the government, which was one of the reasons for the flag march. But they still wanted to show that they're out there and to challenge the new government and to try to find splits within these new governments. Now, Hamas, and this goes to the Palestinian politics, who showed that they're kind of the owners of the Palestinian issue of Jerusalem, they wanted to show that they're responding. And because all the credit that they received in the last round of violence, and they became so much more popular than the Palestinian Authority because they kind of defended Jerusalem, they wanted to show that they're doing something. I'm completely sure that behind the scenes, there were many efforts to coordinate through the Egyptians, including the American administration, to make sure that those groups could do what they want to do for internal politics, but it will not spill over to another round of violence. And that's why the Hamas actions were not that serious, and the Israeli response was not that serious. So each one could say we did what we had to do, but it didn't change the equation and did not get us back to where we were before the ceasefire.
Thank you. So let's talk about the Israeli side of things, and specifically about the new prime minister. As we know, and those of us joining have seen over the last few years, Naftali Bennett is a thoroughly right-wing politician who came up under Netanyahu's tutelage, has consistently presented himself as even more hardline and a right-wing alternative to Netanyahu himself. Bennett has repeatedly made clear that his support for de jure and de facto annexation and his fierce opposition to Palestinian statehood. Can you speak about his track record on these issues and what we can anticipate from him in terms of leadership of this specific coalition as well?
Yeah, I think people outside Israel probably cannot understand how people like me, how people in the Rabin Square parties after this government was sworn, people that demonstrated in Balfour, how come they're all so happy about Bennett being prime minister? And in order to understand this, you have to understand what we went through under Netanyahu, because with Netanyahu, it was much more than ideology. It was someone who put his own political and legal survival above anything. And the corruption and the personality cult and the populist trends that, and the incitement and the poison that he put in Israeli politics were so disgusting that even for leftists like me, Bennett is kind of a fresh air. Because Bennett, he is indeed a right-wing ideologue, but I don't think that he puts his own politics above everything else. And he will try to act within the parameters of this new coalition, which is much more than him. He's only 6 members out of this coalition, and not the strongest party within this coalition. The only reason why he's the first prime minister is because he was kind of the wild card. He could go either way, and the only way to keep him in the anti-Bibi camp was to give him the first prime ministership in the rotation. But we have other players in this government, and that's what makes us somewhat more optimistic. Of course, we have parties that are very much our kind of allies, Meretz, Labor. We have Yesh Atid, who is the strongest party, and I might say Lapid is probably the strongest member of this coalition. And even though Lapid is more central than we are, but he showed amazing leadership skills and really demonstrated, surprisingly, because he didn't start this way in politics. He really became a real leader, putting his ego aside, being very generous with all the members of the coalition. And I think he's trying to keep this kind of ship in the right direction without doing anything major that will create unease for one of the partners of this coalition. On top of that, I have to mention other things in this government that are pretty promising that people might not be aware of. But this government has more women than we ever had in Israeli governments, 9 ministers. We have a very diverse, we have an Arab minister, a Druze minister, Ethiopian minister, Russian minister, minister with disabilities, a gay minister. So while we do have Bennett as prime minister and his ideology is far from us, I still think that this government is an improvement on what we had. And this government will not be able to do something major, not in terms of annexation on the one hand, and not in terms of a big peace initiative on the other side. And that kind of this deadlock keeps a lot of the burden on doing something serious on the other side of the ocean, because the Biden administration could be the one vote, like Kamala Harris in the Senate, that will break this kind of situation and move things towards a much more positive direction.
So let's talk about that relationship, especially when we're thinking about Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, who you mentioned is the foreign minister, and you said that you expect not to see giant, like sort of big moves from this government because of the fragility of the coalition. But let's talk about what he can do. He mentioned repairing ties with Jordan, with US Democrats, and even, will you believe it, with the American Jewish community, in addition to addressing the situation in Gaza. And I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about your expectations from him in this realm, in the realm of diplomacy and in this role as foreign minister, and how he might also counterbalance Bennett on the world stage.
Yeah, I mean, thanks to all of you who voted in America, we have the Biden administration and we have 2 Democratic houses in Congress, and Lapid will work with this reality, and I think he understands that that the relations between the U.S. and Israel are critical for Israel. There is no relations that are more important. I think he also understands the importance of the connection with the Democratic Party and going back to bipartisanship. I think he understands that Jews are not only Orthodox like we might think in Israel. So all those insights, I think, might be very positive. Let's look at the Iran issue, for example. He thinks the Iran deal was bad, like many other Israelis who are, of course, wrong about this. But they were affected by the Netanyahu spin about the JCPOA. By the way, the security people, most of them think differently. But in Israeli politics, it is still kind of a mantra that the JCPOA was bad. But because Lapid is not going to fight the Biden administration like Bibi did, and is not going to kind of get into the American politics and get the Republicans against the administration, Israel will have to find a way to be in the room rather than be out of the room. So even though they don't like the agreement, they will still be, a team player. And I think the same with moves that, whether it's opening the consulate for the Palestinians or whether it's renewing the humanitarian aid for the Palestinians and things like that. Lapid, because he will want to maintain the good relations with Biden and with the Democratic Party, he will definitely be a much more positive player, even if his ideology is not exactly where we are.
Excellent. That certainly warms my heart. What about the other player in the room, Bennett? What can we expect from the Biden-Bennett relationship that also, do we also expect it to be the same or different than the relationship between Biden and Netanyahu?
Well, one of the things that, I was impressed by was the way Biden handled the ceasefire, which showed that, even though this was not a priority for him, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we in J Street are trying to push that it would be more of a priority. But when he had to intervene, he did it in a way that showed that he learned a lot of the lessons from the 8 years he was next to Obama, because both him and President Obama have the same strategic goals. But in terms of how to deal with Israelis, I think he knows better how to deal with Israelis. And he did it in a way that was very effective. He did it in closed room. He didn't say, Israel should do this, should do that. And I think that what led to a ceasefire after 11 days rather than 51 days in the last round. I think he will be able to deal with Bennett in an effective way. But there will be many, many efforts to pressure Bennett from within, from his constituency, from the opposition. Netanyahu as a head of opposition will be very, very tough to deal with. And also people around Bennett, the people that when he goes to their synagogue, the people around him are not where he is now. So it will always be kind of pressures to be kind of this statesman that could deal with America and deal with the world, and to show that he's different than Netanyahu. And on the other hand, how to deal with this constituency that is going to keep on attacking him and to try to create rifts. And it is a question. Nobody knows. I mean, we might have a situation where this government will not survive for too long because of those pressures from within. But I do believe that Bennett wants to be consequential, and he cannot be consequential as the prime minister of this kind of coalition without working pretty nicely with the American administration. So even Bennett, who is against the two states and all of that, will still try to work with the Biden administration in a kind of a constructive way. So I hope it will survive. But nobody predicted the Arab Spring. Nobody predicted the Iranian Revolution in '79, and nobody can predict when this government will fall, because reality could force itself with all the best intentions.
Always keeping us on our toes, Nadav. So, but I want to go a bit deeper actually on the players. Our audience here in the US is always, there's a big mix of names that we're constantly seeing show up. And so I'm wondering if you can speak. You mentioned that Bennett is going to have to, he wants to be this a significant prime minister, and he wants to be successful, but that he's going to need to also contend with some other notable players in his government, in his cabinet. So I'm wondering if you might speak about those players in the cabinet, in the government, who might affect how policy is crafted in this new coalition.
A very important player is Benny Gantz, the defense minister, because he's defense minister now. I mean, he stayed from the last government, and this portfolio is very critical. It's critical because still most Israelis think that that Israel problems are defense and security. They're wrong, by the way. I believe that our fate is much more in diplomacy than in our military, but this is not where most Israelis are. And also because Gantz, again, I'm talking about the American connection, one of the best levers for a US administration on Israel is those connections between DOD, between the Pentagon and the defense establishment in Israel, and the intimacy between those organizations is very important. And Bennett will not want to lose that connection, and Gantz will play on that. For example, when there is something in Area C or in Jerusalem, and Gantz will say, what we hear from our connections in the Pentagon is that this could really be a problem for the Jordanians or whatever, for the Emirates. This is a very important connection for the US and for this government. We have Lieberman, who is, kind of a strange politician, because he's right wing on some issues, is left wing on other issues, is very much kind of for more separation between state and religion, and in this way, kind of counter to Netanyahu in terms of his position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, closer to Bennett. And he's going to be the minister of treasury. And the minister of treasury is always important in any country, especially in Israel, when if you can't pass a budget, the government falls. So it's in Lieberman's hand if we can pass a budget and if this budget will show progress. Because one of the things that this government can really show progress is the economy, is recovery after COVID. If they can't make big decisions on foreign policy or things like that, they could really show that they took the country out of the mess, and that's why Lieberman is also a very important player. We have Mansour Abbas, who's not a minister because they don't want to be ministers. They don't really want to be ministers in a Zionist government, but they decided to be part of the coalition because for the first time in our history, an Arab party is actually taking something from the page of the ultra-Orthodox, which means we are going with whoever gives us what we want. We don't care about the policy. We just want to make sure that our sector is getting what we need. And Abbas is playing that role, and is very important in keeping, even though he's small, only 4 members of Knesset, and one of them kind of abstained in the vote of confidence, but he could still play this role. And then we have we have the 2 parties that we kind of like, Labor and Meretz, who wants this to succeed, and know that they will have to kind of swallow some frogs in order for this to succeed. But very responsible players, Michaeli, Nitzan Horowitz, and of course Yesh Atid, the largest party. And I said a lot about Lapid's leadership style, which is very promising.
Excellent. Like I said, for us in the US, that's a lot of names to keep track of. So thank you for highlighting the important ones. And when we are looking at, you mentioned the close relationship, the close ties between DOD, the Pentagon, with the Israeli defense system. And you also happen to say one of my favorite words, diplomacy. So when it comes to diplomacy, we actually just received some great news in the last 24 hours where President Biden nominated Thomas Nides to be the US ambassador to Israel. I'm hoping that you can speak about what this appointment signals about the US priorities, about Biden's priorities, and what we might expect from Nides as an ambassador. And actually, I'll add on to that as well. What is the take on this from Israel? What are Israelis seeing in this nomination?
First of all, many Israelis were surprised that it took so long to nominate an ambassador, and
Us too.
we always think that we are should be the first on the list, and it was surprising. Tom Nides is not known for many of my friends in the diplomatic corps, because he always was in more administrative roles rather than policy roles, and he was a banker for part of his career. But the people who know him in the US are telling me that he's a very nice guy, very connected to Israel, very close to Biden, and that's very important for an ambassador to be close to the White House. That's a critical thing. In terms of what does it mean, it means that probably, if I understand it correctly, that the Biden administration does not expect the ambassador to Israel to deal with the Palestinian issue or the regional issues. They expect the ambassador to deal with the bilateral issues, with trade, with the bilateral initiatives, and if they and when they will get more involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it will not come from the embassy in Israel. They don't want someone like Friedman, who tried to create policy from Jerusalem, and they want to keep that, kind of close control over the policy on the more political, controversial issues. So Nides, I think, will be an ambassador that will give the Israelis the feeling that Biden loves them and embrace them and promote the bilateral relations. But for major actions in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it will come either from the consulate to Jerusalem or more likely from the NSC and the White House.
Excellent, thank you. And thinking about policy and American policy for Israel and the Palestinians, we know that while we have Biden here in the White House, Bennett, as we mentioned, is considered to be very pro-settlement. Do you see him spending his time as prime minister pushing for more aggressive settlement expansion, and how? And for those of us who care about finding a diplomatic solution to the conflict, how do we bring attention to this issue and push back?
Yeah, so as I said, this government kind of decided not to do anything major, not annexation and not peace process. In the coalition agreement, there is something about Area C, which is kind of give Bennett the visibility that he is going to deal with Jewish control on Area C. But on the other hand, it was giving the responsibility was giving to defense ministry, to Gantz, which means that it is under control, and it is, as I said, very much under American control. But I also said that there will be pressures on Bennett, and he will be faced with all kinds of provocations and push, and we don't know what will happen. No doubt that we will have to be alert here in America, those of us who want the American foreign policy to be assertive on those issues. But I don't think any major thing is going to come out of this Israeli government, not for bad, not for good, in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's more up to the American administration to move the ball forward.
Thanks. And so I'm gonna go towards audience Q&A. We have a great question here from Michael Friedman, actually looking at the other side of the Knesset, the other side of the room. Netanyahu lost, but he remains, or he has become, the leader of the opposition in the Knesset, and it's not a small opposition. Can you explain a bit about what you see as the tactics and strategy coming from a Likud-led opposition, and how it will be sort of uh, putting itself up against the ruling coalition? A good example for us here in the US is the Mitch McConnell style refusing to back anything, or another option is, of course, to be more flexible in their approach as the opposition. I'm wondering if you can speak about that, and also where do Kahanists and extreme right-wingers fall in that opposition scheme?
So, in many ways, Likud is kind of similar to the Republican Party, which became from an ideological conservative party into a kind of personality cult populist party. In your case with Trump, in our case with Bibi, and in both cases, both Trump and Bibi, they lost, but Trumpism and Bibism did not lose yet, and it's live and kicking within Likud. And the question is when the knives will be taken out, and when will other leaders in Likud start to go after Netanyahu and try to replace him. He wants to go for early primaries in order to maintain his grip on the party. No doubt that whether it's him or someone else, they will try to embarrass this government time and time again, especially Bennett. They will try to push legislation that Bennett supported in the past and will not be able to support now, to show him that he sold, his soul, and things like that. In terms of the Kahanists, of course, they're even more to the extreme, and they could do provocations, just like we saw with the flag march and the Sheikh Jarrah situation and the Mount. They're professional provocateurs, and we saw that sometimes even small groups could turn the Middle East into flames, and that's dangerous. And I hope that the new Minister of Internal Security, Omer Bar-Lev, will be smarter in dealing with this than his predecessor, Ohana. I have no doubt that he's smarter, but we'll see how he could maintain the situation. I think also that our police commissioner learned a lot from the last round and is much more capable now to take major decisions than we had in the past. Now, it's important to remember, of course, we have the ultra-Orthodox that right now they're pretty much with Likud, but at some point they might think, well, maybe we should join this government because we're not getting money for our yeshivas, and this is the most important thing. So we might start to see crawling into the government, at least from Shas, maybe less from the Ashkenazi party. And we have the Arab Joint List that is not gonna support the opposition on everything. So there will be things that actually the Arab list will support the government rather than the opposition. And they will give some backing because as much as they're not part of this government, they hate the Bibi and the Kahanists and even more. And in Israel, in order to replace a government, you need to show that this is a constructive vote of non-confidence. You have to have 61 that could show that you could create another government. It's not enough that this government lose majority. You still need, so they will need the Arab list in order to replace this government. So it's gonna be a challenge for the opposition as well. And it's a big question what's going to happen in Likud, especially when the trial of Netanyahu goes on and he might become less capable of leading the party.
Excellent. I do want to highlight that besides the diversity of characters that we're seeing in the opposition, when we spoke about Kahanis, when you just spoke about Kahanis and sort of the extreme right wing, you spoke a lot about the action outside of the Knesset halls, right? Action on the streets. And I'd actually like to follow up on what you just touched on, which is action in the courts. We have two questions from our audience, from Larry White and Jean Berger, touching on the criminal charges against Netanyahu, where really it all comes down to the same question. What are the chances of Netanyahu being convicted? And what is the timeline? Can we see something like that happen within the next 2 years?
So, the legal issues I'm not an expert on, and some people think that even though it's clear that he's corrupt, it's not clear if the prosecution really have a case or not. I can't say, even though it's clear to me that he is corrupted, but it's not enough, as you know. The benefit of the doubt is there. So I don't know. In terms of his ability to distract the process, now he can't do it. And if he would have, if he could have created a coalition, he would still be able to, to replace the attorney general and to do all kind of things against the legitimacy of the courts. Now it will be much harder for him. So now it's about the legal process. But the legal process is very long. It's a very complicated cases with a lot of witnesses, with a lot of evidence that need to be presented. So it will take time. 2 years sounds to me like kind of maybe the right period of time. But I'm not a legal expert.
Excellent. We know you're not a legal expert, but we appreciate your viewpoint. And staying within the context of actually talking about the courts, there's Earl Barg has asked around the judiciary and whether Lapid will have veto power over judicial nominations. Do we expect further attacks on the Israeli Supreme Court?
So this was one of the most sensitive issues in this coalition building, because Gideon Sa'ar, who is the Minister of Justice, is representing a view that is kind of critical of the legal system. And for example, they want to separate the roles of the Attorney General between the one who advised the government on legal issue and the one who prosecute the government when needed. Right now, it's the same person. He wants to do hearings for judges, just like you have in America. And of course, there is a lot of battle about this committee that decides the new judges. And so the decision is that Merav Michaeli is going to be there on this committee to kind of balance Gideon Sa'ar. But I think that Gideon Sa'ar, unlike the Likudniks, even though he was a Likudnik, he comes from there. But his criticism over our legal system is much more reasonable, and even someone who's far from him ideologically could see the rationale in some of the criticism, and the fact that there should be a more transparent process in the way you choose the judges and the Supreme Court. So I think that I'm not expecting big drama there. When it was Yariv Levin, the people who were really acting under Netanyahu, it was all about him and how to attack the courts. With Gideon Sa'ar, it's criticism, it's change, but it's not a non-constructive criticism.
Okay, a little bit of hopefulness. Coming back to our issues, the issue of the relationship also between Israel and the Palestinians, we have a few questions kind of around the same area from Avi Poster, Yuval Leon, Diane Lund. Our audience is asking, you mentioned we don't expect to see this government make any big moves. We're not expecting Bennett to sign a resolution of peace with the Palestinians next week. But do you think that we can see any kind of confidence building measures or even economic investment on the ground with the Palestinians?
Yes, confidence building measures, absolutely. Even Netanyahu spoke about the economic peace and, making the occupation more comfortable for the Palestinians, as long as it's not about a real change in terms of sovereignty. So I don't think that's very controversial. The fact that and this government will not, with the Trump days, it was different. It was craziness, stopping USAID, stopping UNRWA, and of course Netanyahu went along with it. I think now the government will try to move things that are more about the life of Palestinians, and will work with the Biden administration, with USAID, with the Quartet, with the UN, to make things better. The big challenge is what to do with Gaza. because the dilemma is, how do you help rehabilitate Gaza, help the people of Gaza without empowering Hamas? The Netanyahu government always did it through Qatar because they actually wanted to keep Hamas strong enough because they didn't want to do any compromise with the more moderate Palestinians in the West Bank. I think in this government there is kind of a consensus that that you don't want to make Hamas stronger, but Hamas is there; it's not going to disappear, and you have to find a way to work with the international community in order to keep Hamas in kind of contained and not to empower it while getting some humanitarian aid and rehabilitation into Gaza. And it will be done more through the Egyptians and maybe through the UAE, even though with the UAE we have a personal issue that Mahmoud Abbas hates the guts of Dakhlan, who's a Palestinian leader very close to the Emirati leader, Mahmoud bin Zayed. But in general, the UAE could replace Qatar, Egypt could play a more positive role, and then I think it will also be more empowering for the more moderate forces in Fatah rather than helping Hamas.
Excellent. And so let's continue sort of on that line in terms of the relationships with the Arab world and Turkey. We saw Netanyahu. This is a question coming from Sam Birdie, who says, we saw Netanyahu manage these relationships relatively well. What do we expect to see from the new government when it comes to relationships with Saudi Arabia, with Turkey, and with the Gulf states you just spoke about a bit, but even with Russia?
First of all, when people tell me that Netanyahu did it pretty well, I'm not that convinced. I think what Netanyahu really wanted to do is to annex. He wanted to use the Trump plan in order to annex big chunks of the West Bank, which will help him with his settler base and will help Trump with his evangelical base. And the reason why eventually they decided to go for normalization, which was plan B, is because Kushner heard from all the Arab countries that they're not going to accept annexation. And he also heard it, by the way, from Gantz and Ashkenazi from Blue and White, who were part of the government. And that way they decided, okay, so if we give the Emirates and Bahrain the kind of excuse, that we're canceling the annexation, then we can give them more F-35 and other things, getting Sudan off the terrorist list, accepting Morocco control of the Western Sahara, and we could declare victory. But the reason why the Emirates and Bahrain and others wanted to connect with Israel was because they have an anxiety that the Americans are leaving the Middle East. They have an anxiety to be left alone with Iran. They have an anxiety with a more Muslim Brotherhood supported countries like Turkey and Qatar. And they thought that maybe they have joint interests with Israel, plus especially the Emirates, who see further than most in terms of their vision. They understand that oil and gas are not enough and they have to diversify their economy. And the startup nation is the best example of how to diversify their economy. And of course, this was used by Trump and Netanyahu as a great victory, but I think it would have happened at some point, no matter what. What I think Biden would be smart in doing is using that normalization in order to also support the Palestinian issue rather than bypass the Palestinian issue. And the Biden administration is not calling it the Abrahamic Accords, but they are for the normalization. And I think they're going to try to extend it, even though it's not on their priority list at the moment, because they have so much. We just, Biden's trip to Europe with NATO, with Russia, with Turkey, China, the biggest thing. So climate change. So it's not very high on the list, but I think that the Biden administration will find an Israeli government that cares more about the Jordanians, the Egyptians. I don't know if you all read the Ignatius piece in the Washington Post about how Trump and Netanyahu tried to get kind of the Hashemite kingdom off because they were interfering with they're trying to help the Saudis get control. all that is going to go away. And I think there will be much more sane policy, which doesn't split everybody into bad guys and good guys, but actually trying to create more and get some of those conflicts off the Yemen, for example, war, which is crazy humanitarian problem, and the Qatar-Saudi things, Egypt, Turkey. We already seen, even without Biden doing anything, that some of those rifts are being now solved. And the Israeli government, the new Israeli government, Lapid, understand the regional situation on guns. They will help the Biden administration to use the regional situation in order to help some of the other problems, both on the Palestinian issue and in terms of the Iranian threat.
Thank you. So we've spoken a lot about Biden when it comes to the American government. I'm hoping to speak a little bit about Congress and sort of the view from Israel on Congress. And the question we got here from Steve Medalitz is, how is the new government likely to respond to moves in Congress to increase transparency about how US aid is used and to restrict specific uses that advance de facto annexation and support the occupation?
Well, most Israelis think that, we have a very progressive Democratic Party who is pushing Biden to the wrong direction and is somehow holding. And they tend to see kind of the squad and Sanders as the whole Democratic Party. And any mentioning of aid restriction, aid whatever, sounds very frightening to most Israelis. And this is one of my roles, to try to explain to them that no country in the world, including Israel, wouldn't give just support without regulating it and making sure that this money is spent on the reasons why it was given in the first place, which is the security of Israel and not human rights violations in the territories. But when you mention aid, it's kind of a myth. It's kind of a holy cow, as they say in India, which you can't touch. But speaking about Congress, I think Biden would not have intervened with the ceasefire so fast without Congress and the work that J Street did in Congress. I told my colleagues in J Street that this was the first time after many years that I felt consequential being in an organization that actually saved life by pushing Biden to intervene earlier and save people's life. And I think that we are positioned really very much in the center of the Democratic Party in a way that could influence the Biden administration to be more proactive, even when they want to prioritize other things. I think it's completely legitimate that we will put our issue on the top of the agenda, even when America has so many other priorities, because that's how politics works. But for Israelis, it is not easy to understand the nuances within the Democratic Party. For example, I was telling people that it wasn't just the squad or Sanders; it was Menendez. It was it was people who are much more kind of considered mainstream, close to the AIPAC kind of orbit, that called for ceasefire here and kind of moved out of the let's give Israel the latitude that they need to keep on in this quicksand of Gaza. So there is a positive change, but it is still a big challenge to explain it to Israelis.
Thank you. I think, and just keeping an eye on the time, I do want to touch on the relationship. You spoke briefly on the relationship between the Israeli government or Israelis and American Jews. And you mentioned Yair Lapid being, recognizing that not all American Jews are Orthodox, recognizing that there's a diversity and a full culture of American Judaism here in the US. And I'm wondering, I've got a question here from Janet Halbert about the Minister of Diaspora, Nachman Shai. I'm wondering if you can speak about his role and can we count on him to, let's say, ameliorate the relationships between the two communities? And in general, the way that the incoming government is, viewing American Jews and our role.
Yeah, so this issue is one of the most promising in this government. Between the fact that the ultra-Orthodox are not there and they're, and they're not going, and their interests are not going to be considered as highly as before, to the fact that Nachman Shai, who is now the Minister of Diaspora, used to be the representative of JNFA, Jewish National Federation Association in Israel, to the fact that Gilad Kariv, a Reform rabbi, is now in the Knesset, to the fact that Lapid, much more connected with people from the US, other denominations, and even Bennett himself, he is an Orthodox, but he knows America. He was in Silicon Valley. He's knowledgeable, and he knows that it's not, that there are many denominations and different ways to practice your Judaism, and we should respect all of them. So I expect really positive movement in terms of those issues, because the situation in Israel is that the people who really care about this are either the very minority of Reform and conservative in Israel, and a big majority of ultra-Orthodox, not majority, but a big group of Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. And all the secular Jews are pretty, indifferent. And now we have some secular Jews who care about this issue, like Nachman Shai, and I think they will push the country in a direction that will be much more good for Jewish peoplehood and for the connection between Jews in the diaspora, especially in North America and Israel.
Excellent. I think that this is actually an excellent note to end on. A bit of optimism, lots of positivity from our Israel director. I'm going to say thank you to all of those who tuned in with us, whether that's over Zoom or on Facebook, and for sending in your questions. And thank you, of course, Nadav Tamir, for giving us your evening and for sharing your wisdom and viewpoint with us. I feel very lucky to work with you, and I feel very lucky to work with all of you leaders out there who are doing this work with us side by side. So with a bit of hope, optimism, tempered with reality, of course, I'm going to say good afternoon and good evening. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you all.